Welcome to Chapter 5, Developmental Psychology. Slide 2. Over the next slides, I just need you to noodle the following situations and give an honest answer after each one. First one. You spend an evening at your partner's house. At one point, your partner gets a call and goes into the other room to answer it. 20 minutes later, your partner comes back and tells you it was their ex calling to say hello. You know that they're still friends and talk occasionally. Your partner asks if you're okay with the fact that they still talk to their ex. Do you say A, yeah, I'm glad to know you still get along with people you've dated? Or do you say B, not really, I'm a little worried something may still be going on between you two? Slide 3. Your partner continues talking about their ex, and you're starting to feel a little jealous. The week before, someone you used to be interested in called to ask you out, but you didn't tell your partner because it wasn't a big deal to you, and you'd more or less forgotten about it already. While your partner is talking about their ex, you suddenly remember the incident and figure they will probably be jealous if you tell them. Do you A, not mention the incident to them, not wanting them to feel jealous, or B, casually bring up the incident, hoping they will feel a little jealous? Slide 4. The following week, your partner comes over to your place. You are just hanging out and having a good time, and you begin to get into a discussion about the relationship. Your partner says they feel that things are getting serious, and that you should have a discussion about where things are going. Do you say, A, that's a good idea, figuring it can help the relationship if you're both on the same wavelength? Or B, maybe we should take a break, figuring they're having second thoughts about the relationship and you should end things before they do? Slide 5. All right, so for your information, option A denoted a secure attachment. If you chose B for any of the situations we just went over, you may not have a secure attachment style, or to put it negatively, you have tendencies towards an insecure attachment style. But what the hell does any of this have to do with studying developmental psychology? Even though most people think of babies when they think of developmental psychology, and hey, little humans, who doesn't love them? What better place to look for the origins of adult human behavior and experience than our early development? The psychological study of development researches how humans change over a lifetime from birth to death. And in studying human development, we're looking into what reliable changes occur cognitively, behaviorally, and socially at different epochs of our lifetime. For example, there is evidence to connect the style of attachment you have in adult relationships with the kind of attachment you experienced as a child. From that perspective, just looking at attachment in children is only looking at half the picture. Slide 6. This lecture on human development will be split into 4 subtopics. After looking at prenatal development and the newborn child, we'll spend some time looking at how psychologists study development. That is, the methods and techniques used to collect data about humans even when we're too young to talk, read, or write. Next, I'll quickly describe the psychological functions we're born with as a starting point for a larger discussion about different theories of development, from how our thoughts and perceptions change and develop over time, to how our interactions with the world around us become savvier over time. Slide 7. Before we dive into how development is studied from birth, let's acknowledge that development absolutely begins in the womb. I'm going to cover some basic biology now without getting too deep because everything I'm about to cover will be unpacked in detail in your required Bio 101 course. If you've taken that already, this is a super short review. If you haven't, this is a super short primer. During prenatal development, everyone starts as a fertilized egg cell or zygote that develops through its first few stages until it becomes a fetus about 8 weeks after conception. How's that for short? I'm just kidding. Here's some more. Of interest to psychologists is the fact that as soon as 6 weeks after conception, the nervous system is mature enough to produce a few movements, even if they are spontaneous, that is, not elicited by any stimulus. The muscles and the nerves controlling these movements begin to mature and are essential for proper spinal cord development. Later, but still before birth, the sense organs appear, with hearing being one of the first. The head and the eyes begin to turn towards sounds, and the brain, a crucial part of the central nervous system, alternates between waking and sleeping. All this is the beginning of perception, and therefore the beginning of human psychology. Any damage to the physical development of the nervous system could have downstream effects on other aspects of psychological development. Let's use alcohol as an example. A serious risk arises if a fetus is exposed to alcohol. If the mother drinks alcohol during pregnancy, the infant may develop fetal alcohol syndrome, a condition marked by malformation of the face, heart, and ears, and nervous system damage including seizures, hyperactivity, and impairments of learning, memory, problem solving, attention, and motor coordination. Still, I don't want to make it sound determined that potentially high-risk children will unnecessarily suffer for the rest of their lives. Whether small at birth, exposed to alcohol or other drugs before birth, from a disadvantaged family, with resilience, we have the ability to overcome obstacles and become healthy and successful. And while resilience does relate to genetic influences and education, it is also related to supportive family and friends. That is, we all have a role in each other's developmental outcome regardless of how old we are. We're in this together. Slide 8. Okay, we've covered prenatal development. Let's start talking about how we study development. Slide 9. If you remember me talking about John Locke from a couple lectures ago, we can say that, with confidence, John Locke had it wrong that the mind at birth is white paper, void of all characters without any ideas. Prenatally, we've already developed a nervous system and sense organs, and therefore have already engaged in learning before birth. For example, that newborn infants prefer the sound of their mother's voice to other voices is a clear indication that they've spent some time prenatally learning the sound of their mother's voice. And by learning, I mean passive learning, not active. The mere ubiquity of the mother's voice in the womb is enough to imprint information into the memory of a human. That is the learning I'm talking about. Once born, how do we collect data from baby humans to figure out what they already do and don't know? They can't fill out forms, take surveys, or answer questions. So researchers need to be creative in collecting data indirectly. In short, we look at behaviors like head turning, looking time, heart rate, and sucking response using the techniques of habituation and dishabituation to determine what stimuli are novel, new, or familiar, to determine what stimuli are novel, new, or unfamiliar to the infant, and which stimuli they prefer.
Techniques used to test whether something is novel or familiar to an infant are important because they provide insight into what the infant knows and has learned. That is, if a stimulus is familiar, it can be inferred that the infant has that stimulus already stored in their memory, which further indicates that they had previously encountered that stimulus and have passively learned to expect it. Some common ways novelty and familiarity are studied in infants include the head turn response, where they orient their head towards perceived novel events or objects, looking time, meaning they look longer at objects that sustain interest that are novel, heart rate will accelerate if the perceived stimulus is frightening or alarming or novel, and differential sucking rate. It has been shown that infants suck more on perceived novel objects, and they also suck faster in the face of novel stimuli. When looking at preference, you can also use head turn and looking time. This works on the assumption that infants turn their head towards and look longer at the stimuli they prefer. These techniques can be used over a wide variety of stimuli and in combination with other techniques. For instance, like all humans, Infants get used to and stop paying attention to things in their environment that are always there and that they expect. A simple example for us is to observe that we are wearing clothes or a watch or glasses, but are rarely paying attention to what it feels like to wear those. Our brain has determined they're not important enough to make it into consciousness, and we therefore don't even respond to the stimulus anymore. This process of getting used to and not paying attention to something is called habituation, or a decreased response to a repeated stimulus. With the technique of habituation, psychologists can induce familiarity in infants and can use it to determine what degree of change in the stimulus is necessary for the infants to take interest again. That is, how long does it take for the stimulus to become novel again? This process is called dishabituation, or an increase in the previously habituated response as a result of a change in the stimulus. Let's walk through an example of habituation. If I introduce a musical melody to an infant and loop it so it always plays and continuously plays over a few minutes, the infant will eventually react to this novel stimulus, and over those few minutes of continuous play, they'll get bored and stop paying attention, and their responses will decrease. That is, they will habituate. If, after habituating to the original melody, I introduce a slightly altered melody, the infant may react with as much or even more of a response than they did to the original melody. If they do, this can be inferred to mean that the infant recognizes the change. With these techniques, researchers can explore the earliest experiences of humans. But we change so rapidly in our first years here on Earth, how do we track changes in experience and behavior over time? Slide 10. The four main methods used for testing and answering questions about human development are cross-sectional studies, longitudinal studies, sequential studies, and microgenetic studies. Each method has its advantages and disadvantages, so let's quickly review them. A cross-sectional study compares different groups of individuals of different ages at the same time. So if you wanted to compare 3, 5, and 7-year-olds on some measure, you could get a group of 3-year-olds, a separate group of 5-year-olds, and then another separate group of 7-year-olds, and test them all, and then look at the differences in the results. If you had more time available for your research, you could also test one large group of 3-year-olds, then bring that same group back to test when they turn 5, and then bring that same group back again to test when they are 7 years old. This approach is called a longitudinal study. The advantage of the longitudinal study is it's the exact same people coming in each time, just at different ages. The downside of the longitudinal studies is the time commitment. It's very resource intensive. Using a sequential method, you can combine cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. Start by testing a group of 3, 5, and 7-year-olds, then have all of them come back 2 years later when the 3-year-olds are 5, the 5-year-olds are 7, and the 7-year-olds are 9. And then have that whole group of people come back 2 years later when the 5-year-olds are 7 and the 7-year-olds are 9 and the 9-year-olds are 11. This is like the best of both worlds of research methods, which is its advantage, but it has a major drawback in that it takes so much time and resources, even more so than the longitudinal study. Finally, if we were interested in a specific phenomenon, like being able to move your body in sync with the rhythm of music, and you knew the developmental time frame within which it would blossom, say late 2, early 3 years old, you could set up a study to test very frequently during that time, during that Goldilocks zone, when you expect to see the phenomenon blossom. It's like a mini longitudinal study in that you're testing the same population over time, but instead of testing every couple of years, testing is done several times a week for a few months that capture the mechanism of this phenomenon. This gives researchers a high-resolution picture of the phenomenon as it unfolds, the precursors, the onset, and the acquisition. Again, this is called a microgenetic study. Slide 11. We have revealed that human development begins in the womb. We've reviewed the techniques and methods used to collect data about human development from the time we're born. Now let's take a look at the newborn infant and see what apps are preloaded in us before we cover theories about what happens in infancy and beyond. Slide 12. The hearing app. Our sense of hearing is pretty well developed when we're born, as demonstrated by both our preference for our mother's voice over the voices of others, and how sensitive we are in changes to sounds. To test how sensitive we are to changes to sound, we can use the technique of habituation and dishabituation that we talked about earlier, and we'll use it with the endpoint of sucking rate, that is, the rate with which an infant sucks. As a reminder, habituation is the decreased response to repeated stimulus, and dishabituation is the increase of a previously habituated response as a result of a change in the stimulation. Once you measure a baseline of an infant's sucking rate, you can introduce an auditory stimulus like the sound ba. This novel stimulus should cause the infant to suck faster at first. But after 5 minutes of hearing the sound ba on loop, the sucking rate will decrease to almost the baseline rate. This is the habituation effect right here. Now, if after 5 minutes of ba, you switch it up to da, and in case you can't hear that, I went from a B-A to a D-A, like da-da. You can look at the sucking rate to see if the infant noticed the subtle difference, and if it does, the sucking rate will increase. This is dishabituation. And yes, infants can tell the difference between ba and da. We are born with an app that allows us to distinguish different sounds. And the results for this kind of study, where sucking rate is looked at in the presence of syllables of ba and da, these are reported in the graph on the slide. So the top line represents a normal sucking rate, and then the novel stimulus of ba is introduced, and you can see that the sucking rate goes higher. Then after 5 minutes, it goes back down to almost baseline. And then when you switch the ba up to da, the sucking rate goes back up. Slide 13. Infant Vision App. Newborns stare at some visual patterns longer than others. Even 2-day-old infants spend more time looking at drawings of human faces than at other patterns with similar areas of light and dark. The ability to recognize faces starts basic, but continues developing for years. Slide 14. Here is some data to demonstrate that. Given the option of colors, newsprint, concentric circles, or a face drawing, infants pay more time attending to the face drawing. Slide 15. And using looking time as an endpoint, we can show infants different kinds of faces to determine what they recognize as a face, with the assumption they prefer faces and will look longer at faces than non-faces. We can assume that the pictures the infant stares at longer are the ones they recognize as faces. It turns out that infants will stare about equally at a regular face or one that is a bit distorted, as long as the distortion doesn't change the following: keep the eyes on the top, keep the nose in the middle-ish, and keep the mouth on the bottom. That is, as long as most of the contents of the face are on the top half of an oval, it qualifies as a face to infants. Slide 16. Many studies have used the fact that infants learn to suck harder on a nipple if their sucking turns on a sound. Investigators then determined whether infants suck harder for some sounds than for others. In one study, babies younger than 3 days old could turn on a tape recording of a woman's voice by sucking on a nipple. The results? They sucked more frequently to turn on recordings of their own mother's voice than another woman's voice. Apparently, they preferred their own mother's voice. Because they showed this preference as early as the day of birth, psychologists believe that the infants learned the sound of the mother's voice before birth. So not only are we born with an app that distinguishes sounds, we already prefer the sound of the mother's voice. Carolyn Rovey Collier demonstrated that infants can learn a response and remember it. She attached a ribbon to an ankle so that an infant could activate a mobile by kicking with one leg. 2-month-old infants quickly learned this response and generally kept the mobile going non-stop for a full 45-minute session. They remembered what to do when the ribbon was reattached several days later. 6-month-old infants remembered the response for 2 weeks. Even after they forgot it, they quickly relearned it. Slide 17. Let's take a look at the theories of human development. Slide 18. Until the 17th century, the dominant view in much of Europe was that children were miniature adults with small-scale adult traits, virtues, and vices. John Locke helped change that a touch with his idea that we are born a blank slate, admitting that the accumulation of experience gained through aging contribute to the adult mind, such that there is a difference between an experienced mind and an inexperienced mind. This rough version of a mind developing with experience was further tethered to age 2 centuries later with Darwin, whose model of evolution served as inspiration for viewing life itself as moving from simple to complex. That is, much like evolution, psychological development moves from simplicity to complexity in an inevitable progress from infancy to maturity. The theories of development that we're going to cover will fall into one of 2 different buckets. First, cognitive development, and second, social or emotional development. While these categories overlap and interweave substantially through development in real life, for the purposes of research and for the purposes of this class, they will be thought of as representing the 2 sides of the nature-nurture coin. While cognitive development can be seen as representing nature because thought processes are occurring within the mind of a child or individual, that is, its focus is on the inside of the person, social development represents the nature side of the coin because it tracks how individuals' social and emotional behavior influences and is influenced by the environment, culture, and society. That is, its focus is on the interaction with the outside of the person. Slide 19. Cognitive development. So Jean Piaget was a boy genius, publishing scientific articles by the time he was 16 years old. Jean Piaget ended up working with a co-inventor of the intelligence test, Alfred Binet's collaborator, Theodore Simon. Piaget concluded after extensive observation of children and how they problem solve that children have qualitatively different thought processes from adults. According to Piaget, as children develop intellectually, they do more than just accumulate facts and experiences as Locke may have made you believe. They construct new mental processes. In Piaget's terminology, behavior is based on schemata, the plural of schema. A schema is just an organized way of interacting with objects, and this begins with our reflexes. For instance, infants have a grasping schema and a sucking schema. We are born able to grasp and suck reflexively. During the growth of intelligence, older infants gradually add new schemata and adapt their old ones, not through mere maturation of the nervous system, but through a process of assimilation and accommodation, transforming the mind through experience. Assimilation means applying an old scheme to new objects or problems. For example, when a child sees animals move and then sees the sun and moon move, the child may assume that the sun and moon are alive like the animals. Accommodation means modifying an old schema to fit a new object or problem. A child may learn that only living things move on their own is a rule with exceptions, and that the sun and the moon are not alive. Infants shift back and forth between assimilation and accommodation. That is, mental development is the result of an ever-changing interaction between the organism and its environment, and through the process of assimilation and accommodation, according to Piaget. Our mind develops from infancy through adolescence through adulthood. Slide 20. Piaget contended that children progress through 4 major stages of intellectual development: the sensory motor stage, the pre-operational stage, the concrete operation stage, and the formal operation stage. The ages are variable and not everyone reaches the formal operation stage. However, all people progress through the stages in the same order. Piaget called the first stage of intellectual development the sensory motor stage, because at this early age, the first 1.5 to 2 years of life, behavior is mostly simple motor responses to sensory stimuli. For example, as we mentioned earlier, the grasp reflex and the sucking reflex. Children in the sensory motor stage respond to what they see, hear, or feel at the moment. In the pre-operational stage, children lack reversible operations. For example, a boy with one brother will assert that his brother has no brother. For a boy to understand that his brother has a brother, he must be able to reverse the concept of having a brother. According to Piaget, 3 typical aspects of pre-operational thought are egocentrism, difficulty distinguishing appearance from reality, and a lack of the concept of conservation. According to Piaget, young children's thought is egocentric. By this, he meant that a child sees the world as centered around him or herself and cannot easily take another person's perspective. If you sit opposite a preschooler, the child can describe how the blocks on the table look from the child's side, but not how they would look from your side. That's why in the example of the brother, it is so difficult for a child at this age to recognize that they are the brother of their brother. So putting themselves in the position of their brother is what allows them to recognize that, yes, they also have a brother. That brother is me. That inability to take themselves out of themselves is the egocentricity that Piaget is addressing. To say that a child is egocentric implies that he or she does not understand what other people know or don't know. Psychologists say that a young child lacks, but gradually develops, theory of mind, which is an understanding that other people have a mind too, and that each person knows some things that other people don't know. During Piaget's preoperational stage, children apparently do not distinguish clearly between appearance and reality. For example, a child who sees you put a white ball behind a blue filter will say that the ball is now blue. When you ask, yes, I know the ball looks blue, but what color is it really? The child still replies that the ball is really blue. Slide 20. According to Piaget, preoperational children lack the concept of conservation. They fail to understand that objects conserve such properties as number, length, volume, area, and mass after changes in the shape or arrangement of the objects. They cannot perform the mental operations necessary to understand the transformations. For example, if we show two equal glasses with the same amount of water, and then pour the contents of one glass into a third glass that is a little taller and thinner, children in the pre-operational stage will say that that third tall, thin glass contains more water than the other two. This is demonstrated in the first row of the slide, showing the conservation of liquid. Going down, if we use checkers as an example, this would be a demonstration of conservation of number. If we took two rows of checkers, each of them having 6 checkers, and took one of them and spread them out and asked which line has more checkers, a child in the pre-operational stage would choose the one with the checkers that are more spread out, thinking that that's more, even though it's the same number, it's 6. Another example would be if you had 2 balls of clay and you took one out and rolled it out into a cigar. Well, cigars are longer and look kind of bigger than just balls of dough. So if you were to ask a child which of the two has more clay in it, they would choose the long one. And as a demonstration of conservation of length, if you took 2 sticks that are the same length and then shifted one to the right and asked which one is longer, even though we both know they're the same size sticks, a child in pre-operational stage would choose the one that's nudged a little bit to the right. Why? Because they're lacking the ability to calculate these levels of conservation. Slide 22. At about age 7, children enter into the stage of concrete operations and begin to understand the conservation of physical properties. According to Piaget, during the stage of concrete operations, children perform mental operations on concrete objects, but still have trouble with abstract or hypothetical ideas. For example, if you ask, if you could have a third eye anywhere on your body, where would you put it? Children in this stage generally respond immediately that they would put it right between the other two, on their foreheads. Older children suggest more imaginative ideas, such as on the back of their head, in the stomach so that they could see their food while they digest it, or on the tip of their finger so they could peek around corners. Adults and older children are in the formal operations stage, in which they plan strategies and deal with hypothetical or abstract questions. According to Piaget, children reach the stage of formal operations at around 11. Later researchers found that many people reach this stage later or not at all. Slide 23. Piaget regarded the 4 stages of intellectual development as distinct. He believed a transition from one stage to the next required a major reorganization of thinking, like a caterpillar metamorphosizing into a chrysalis, or a chrysalis metamorphosizing into a butterfly. That is, intellectual growth is discontinuous and has periods of revolutionary reorganization. Later researchers cast doubt on this. If it were true, then a child in a given stage of development, say the pre-operational stage, should perform the acts Piaget lists consistency at the level he prescribes for that stage. Well, in fact, children's performance fluctuates as the task is made more or less difficult, and the cognitive development might be more continuous than Piaget would have liked to admit. Also, In reaction to Piaget's notion that a child must discover concepts on their own, there is a researcher by the name of Lev Vygotsky who pushed back on this claim and said that sometimes a child needs help bridging what they can do themselves with things that are a little bit out of their reach but can be learned with assistance. Vygotsky called this the zone of proximal development, and using Piaget's concept of conservation as an example, it might not be fruitful to teach a 4-year-old about conservation, but a 6-year-old who doesn't understand it yet can be taught it and understand it with help. Slide 24. Before we transition into social development, I wanted to touch on a popular media topic that touches on cognitive development, the Mozart effect. Some of you may be familiar with the Baby Mozart series or the general idea that babies who listen to Mozart gain intellectual benefits. This is another psychological myth used to grift money from willing parents who want overachieving children. Curiously enough, it is actually based on a serious research study. So let's see what went wrong. In the early 90s, a group of researchers showed that immediately after listening to a Mozart piece, participants improved their scores on an intelligence subtest, the paper folding and cutting task that you see in the lower right-hand side. These researchers and others were able to replicate the effect that quickly spread as the Mozart effect, but none of these results showed a long-term effect, and the subjects were adults and not children or infants. This didn't stop the marketing of Mozart products to parents as a tool in their mission to create a super baby with maximized intelligence. Bring forth the explosion of baby Mozart, baby Einstein, super awesome brainybabies.com products. I think I made that last one up. Eventually, through more research, it was shown that the Mozart effect has no effect on infants and children, and any Mozart effect seen in adults can be chalked up to arousal, regardless of whether that arousal is the result of listening to Mozart or having a cup of coffee. Here's a good example of the self-correcting nature of science. It looked like a scientific study was making an incredible claim about music and intelligence. More research refined what was happening during this phenomenon. Also, baby Einstein got sued in 2009 for making claims it couldn't back up, forcing them to offer full refunds to anyone who bought their stuff. So, there's that. There's legal ramifications for shoddy science in products that you're selling. Grifting. Slide 25. Okay, we've covered cognitive development. Now we're going to cover psychosocial development. And this gets fun and interesting kind of quick. So let's move on to slide 26. Here's where we get back to Freud. So as mentioned, Freud made many contributions in many fields of psychology, and one that he has quite heavily influenced is human development. Also, as a reminder, Freud very much thought that behavior was motivated by the need to satisfy 3 basic drives through the id, which the superego eventually tries to control, while the ego referees the octagon match between the id and superego. That is, Freud very much saw humans as being bad. So if we were to ask Freud the human nature question, he would say, yeah, not so much. We are an id that needs controlled. In Freud's psychosexual theory of childhood development, the libido gets fixated and focused on different body parts through development. But if at any stage a fundamental need is not met, the child can develop a fixation or compulsive behavior that we may or may not be aware of, representative of that unmet need. This is where the idea of oral fixations comes from. Freud's developmental theory was an important part of his overall psychodynamic theory of personality. He felt that our current personality is very dependent on the success we had in satisfying drives when we were children. Let's take a look at Freud's stages of psychosexual development with the understanding that we can swap out the term sexual for pleasurable. So I guess it's his theory of psychopleasurable development, starting with the oral stage. From birth until around 2 years old, we are in the first of Freud's stages, the oral stage, in which the child explores the environment mostly with their mouth. That is, mouthy behaviors cause pleasure, whether the source is food, a thumb, or any other random object within grasp. In Freud's terms, he would say that the lips, tongue, and gums are the focus of pleasurable sensations in the baby's body. This coincides with a stage of life when most waking hours are spent being nourished and fed. The inability to successfully satisfy oral drives could, according to Freud, lead to such fixations in adulthood that may manifest as an eating disorder, smoking, or talking too much. Moving on to the anal stage. This is between the first and third year of life. In this stage, the anus is the focus of pleasurable sensations in the baby's body and coincides with the age at which toilet training is the most important activity. That is, the ability to control the bowels and bladder dominates this stage of development. The inability to successfully satisfy anal drives could, according to Freud, lead to anal fixations in adulthood, like being anal retentive, a term you may have heard for somebody with an overemphasis on details, structure, and order, like having obsessive-compulsive disorder, or being anal expulsive, which is the opposite, and also a less popular term, for someone who lacks any attention to detail. Someone who is anal expulsive would be considered a slob. The next stage is the phallic stage, which lasts from 3 to 6 years old. You heard me. It's literally called the phallic stage. Now, this demonstrates two things. One, Freud is not giving women their due. And two, this demonstrates just how patriarchal a society Freud lived in, that he was able to get away with these labels and descriptors for these stages. Stages meant, by the way, to be applied to everybody. Anyway, during the phallic stage, the focus is on the genitalia and the newfound pleasure derived from genital stimulation. According to Freud, it is during this stage that boys are proud of their penises, whereas girls wonder why they don't have one. And this realization of sex differences changes the psychological dynamic between parents and children, leading to the Oedipal complex for boys and the Electra complex for girls, which was added later by Carl Jung. During these complexes, children are in competition with their same-gendered parent for the attention of their opposite-gendered parent, so much so that boys fear being castrated, while girls are frustrated in their attempts for the object of their envy. The solution, it turns out, is to learn how to behave like your competitor to get a partner like theirs. The inability to successfully satisfy phallic drives could, according to Freud, lead to fixations in adulthood, like over-competitiveness in general, and specifically towards partners, leading to flirtatiousness and promiscuity that may actually hide contempt or worthlessness. When children hit 6 to 11 years old, there is the latency stage, according to Freud. And this really isn't a stage. Latency is an interlude during which sexual needs are quiet and children put psychic energy into conventional activities like schoolwork and sports. Until, of course, they reach the genital stage, which happens during adolescence. In this stage, the genitals are still the focus of pleasurable sensations, but not in a competitive way. The young person seeks sexual stimulation and sexual satisfaction in intimate relationships that are hopefully the result of successfully having passed through the phallic stage. That is, you are pursuing a partner, not collecting an object. Now, I understand that's a lot to take in, and it's among the more dramatic theories of development. But if we take out the anatomical parts from the theory, it kind of makes sense, right? So how about if we just renamed some of these stages? Instead of the oral stage, it could be the survival stage. That makes sense. Freud could claim everything that he claims in the oral stage. Just name it something else. Or instead of the anal stage, how about this? Picking up on others' rules. The picking up on other rules stage. It doesn't roll off the tongue quite as quickly, but it's a little better than the anal stage, don't you think? And maybe instead of the phallic stage, we could do the socialization stage. After which there's latency and then something like, I don't know, the intimate relationship stage. We can get rid of these phallic genital language stages. Anyway, there you go, Freud. I know you're not alive to appreciate it, but we went and fixed it for you. Slide 27. Both Piaget and Freud's theories, regardless of which you prefer, only account for life up to adolescence. This makes sense if you consider their topic of focus. Cognitive development reaches a plateau in adolescence where we've acquired the tools we need for the rest of our lives. And the same for psychosexual development as it applies to coping mechanisms. Well, what about the rest of life? Even Shakespeare accounted for a lifespan of development in As You Like It, when, during a soliloquy, he points out what can be called the circle of human life, beginning and ending vulnerable and babylike. In the prose of Shakespeare, humans begin as the infant, mewling and puking in the nurse's arms, and end with a second childishness and a mere oblivion, sans teeth, sans eyes, sans taste, sans everything. Sans means without in French. Erikson was inspired to study psychoanalysis after being psychoanalyzed by Freud's daughter, Anna Freud. After moving to the United States and gaining experience as a psychoanalyst, taking part in longitudinal studies, and investigating Native American cultures, Erikson began to view human development as a lifelong process. Erikson's psychosocial model of development, proposed in the 1950s, sounds similar to Freud's psychosexual model, not only in the name, but also when you look at it in general terms. He also has stages that have crises that need to be resolved. And if these crises are not resolved, they can persist with somebody throughout the rest of their lives. Kind of sounds like the fixation model that Freud uses, right? Unlike Freud, Erikson doesn't really take a stance on whether children are born good or bad. He's more interested in how interactions with the environment and society develop as children develop, and what effects these have on the child's sense of identity. Slide 28. Erikson's stages of development fit perfectly with Freud's as far as ages are concerned. So from birth to the first year of life, instead of talking about an oral stage like Freud would, Erikson talks about the conflict of trust versus mistrust. And during this stage, babies either trust that others will take care of their basic needs like nourishment, warmth, cleanliness, and physical contact, or they will develop mistrust. An infant with a supportive environment forms strong attachments that positively influence future relationships with other people. An infant who is mistreated fails to form a trusting relationship and has trouble developing close ties with people later. Before we go on to any other of Erikson's stages, I want to do a deep dive into this concept of attachment because it has been shown to be very important in social development. Slide 29. Attachments are a feeling of closeness towards another person, and they begin in infancy and are an important aspect of human life. Consider how helpless we are as we start life. We depend on others for our needs, and through this process become secure that they will be met, while also forming an emotional attachment with caregivers. In a series of papers culminating in a 1969 publication, Attachment and Loss, British psychologist John Bowlby proposed what he termed an attachment behavioral system, which is an amalgam of Freudian theory and evolution in the form of if-then statements. The function of the attachment system is to motivate proximity-seeking behaviors between children and caregivers to facilitate attachment. Bowlby theorized that the infant is genetically programmed to behave in certain ways, like crying or smiling, making sounds or cooing, and these behaviors evoke care and hence survival, and that the mother's nurturance engenders attachment in the infant at a sensitive period of his or her development. This powerful special bond, which gives the infant's sense of trust and security, is crucial to normal personality development. Without it, Bowlby said, the child is likely to develop an affectionless character and to be permanently vulnerable to psychopathy. Bowlby was working from the proposition that infants who develop good attachments have a good sense of security and safety, and those without strong attachments have trouble developing close relationships later in development, a sentiment echoing Erikson's position on unresolved conflict during the trust versus mistrust stage. Bowlby's ideas were put to the test and in the lab by Mary Ainsworth, who he co-published with in 1965, and the two are often cited together when talking about attachment. Most research on attachment has measured it in the strange situation, pioneered by Mary Ainsworth in the 1970s. The strange situation is meant to evoke both stranger anxiety and separation anxiety in the infant to look at how the infant behaves. What's interesting is that Ainsworth's original aim was to see how infants react when their mothers are absent. She unexpectedly found that how they react when the mother comes back is even more interesting. Slide 30. And so here's a breakdown of the protocol. At first, the mother and child, typically 12 to 18 months old, play in a room. Then, the mother lets the child play alone. At this point, the child can be observed using the mother as the source space or emotional battery. Then the stranger enters the room. At this point, the child may experience stranger anxiety. Then the mother leaves the infant with the stranger. At this point, the child may experience separation anxiety. Then the mother returns, the stranger leaves, and the mother comforts the child if needed. At this point, we observe the reunion behavior. Then finally, the mother leaves again and the stranger enters to attempt to offer comfort. Here is another opportunity for separation and stranger anxiety, with the mother returning at the very end to deliver comfort if needed. At this point, we see more reunion behavior. Through a one-way mirror, a psychologist observes the infant's reactions to each coming and going. Slide 31. For a majority of children tested, about 62%, Bowlby's predictions proved correct. Securely attached children experience stranger anxiety as well as separation anxiety and engage in proximity-seeking behavior with the mother to ease that anxiety. A secure attachment style in children uses the parent as the emotional battery, is upset with separation, but is soothed by the parent upon reunion. The children that displayed an insecure attachment style fell into two different categories: anxious resistant or avoidant. The anxious resistant style, while most children experience distress at being abandoned, some cling to their mother, resistant to being separated. And when mother returns, they crawl towards her but resist being comforted, as if to signal a protest to what just happened. This style of insecure attachment would be considered anxious resistant. Avoidant. Children whose behavior flies in the face of Bowlby's idea of proximity seeking for the purpose of reducing stress are the ones who employ an avoidant insecure style. An avoidant insecure style avoids the parents, not even preferring the parent to the stranger. While the mother is present, the infant does not stay near her and seldom interacts with her. The infant may or may not cry when she leaves. It does not go to her when she returns. Unfortunately, this attachment style might be the result of abusive or neglectful caregivers. Children who are punished for relying on a caregiver will learn to avoid seeking help in the future. A fourth category was added with Ainsworth's blessings in the 1990s. The disorganized, disoriented attachment style. These children appear to have no coping mechanism for their distress. That is, while the other three styles showed a predictable and consistent strategy for dealing with distress, some children's behavior showed no such consistency or predictability. That is, it was disorganized, as though the child was disoriented by the events completely. The strange situation also can be used to evaluate the relationship between child and father, child and grandparent, or other relationships. As a rule, the quality of one relationship correlates with the quality of others. Those who show a secure attachment in infancy are more likely than others to form high-quality romantic attachments in adulthood. They're quick to resolve conflicts with romantic partners and other people. One variable that seems to play an important part in a child developing secure attachments is temperament, their tendency to be active or inactive, and to respond vigorously or quietly to new stimuli. Temperament is fairly consistent throughout life for most people and considered to be genetic. Since we're talking about nature-nurture, let's point to an environmental factor that may also impact attachment style: how responsive the parents are to the infant's needs, including holding, touching, facial expressions, and so forth. Okay, with a hopefully secure attachment style, we move on to Erikson's other stages. Slide 32. From about 1 to 3 years old, humans struggle with the conflict between autonomy and shame and doubt. In this stage, according to Erikson, children either become self-sufficient in many activities, including toileting, like Freud's anal stage, feeding, walking, exploring, and talking, or they begin to doubt their own abilities and risk feeling shame. After passing through the second stage with the confidence of autonomy, we enter the stage of initiative versus guilt, which lasts from 3 to 6 years old. This would correspond with Freud's phallic stage. For Erikson, this is a stage where children either want to undertake adult-like activities or internalize the limits and the prohibitions set by parents. They either feel adventurous or guilty as a result of this decision. Moving on to industry versus inferiority or latency for Freud, from 6 to 11 years old, children are busily learning to be competent and productive in mastering new skills, according to Erikson. Or they feel inferior and unable to do anything. And now we enter adolescence. With the foundations of trust, autonomy, initiative, and competency, adolescents try to find themselves and answer the questions, who am I and who will I be? Adolescents establish sexual, political, religious, gender, race, and vocational identities, or are confused about what roles to play. Erikson named this final stage of childhood identity versus role confusion, because in adolescence, the key issue is identity. Slide 33. Whereas attachment to parents or other caregivers is critical for infants, relationships with age mates becomes increasingly important during childhood and adolescence. Around puberty, the onset of sexual maturity, sexual interest begins to enter into peer relationships. Most adolescents report occasional periods of moodiness and conflict with their parents in early adolescence, though the conflicts decrease in later adolescence. As a rule, adolescents who receive sympathetic support and understanding experience less conflict with their parents. So we don't have to kill our kids.
Excellent news.
Adolescents make impulsive, risky decisions, mainly when they decide quickly, especially under peer pressure. Slide 34. An adolescent's concern with decisions about the future and the quest for self-understanding has been called an identity crisis. Identity development has two major elements. First, whether one is actively exploring the issue, and second, whether one has made any decisions. The possibilities can be diagrammed using the grid on the slide. Those who haven't given any serious thought to making decisions and who have no clear sense of identity are said to have identity diffusion. They are not actively concerned with their identity at the moment. Identity diffusion is more common among people with low self-esteem and a hopeless, pessimistic attitude toward life. People in identity moratorium are considering the issues but not yet making decisions. They experiment with various possibilities and imagine themselves in different roles but postpone any choices. Identity foreclosure is a state of reaching firm decisions without much thought. For example, a young man might be told that he is expected to go into the family business with his father. And finally, identity achievement is the outcome of having explored various possible identities and then making one's own decisions. Identity achievement does not come all at once. For example, you might decide about your career, but not about your marriage. You might also decide about a career and then reconsider the decision later. Slide 35. According to David Elkind, teenagers are likely to harbor beliefs about themselves that he calls the personal fable, the conviction that I am special. What is true for everyone else is not true for me. Up to a point, this fable supports an optimistic look on life, but it becomes dangerous if it leads people to take foolish risks. Moving on to adulthood. Slide 36. According to Erikson, the key decision of young adulthood is intimacy or isolation. That is, sharing your life with someone else or living alone. The quality of an intimate relationship has an enormous impact throughout adult life. And here's where we boomerang back to the importance of attachment styles formed in infancy. Slide 37. Bartholomew and Horowitz extended the research of Ainsworth into young adulthood and posed 4 styles of relationship attachments. There's secure. When you have positive thoughts of you and your partner, you can be comfortable with intimacy and autonomy. There's dismissive avoidant. When you have positive thoughts about yourself, but negative thoughts about your partner, your strong independence may cause you to dismiss intimacy. Preoccupied. When you have negative thoughts of yourself, but positive thoughts about your partner, you may seem desperate for intimacy and therefore become preoccupied with relationships. And then fearful or fearful avoidant. And then fearful or fearful avoidant. If you have both negative thoughts of yourself and your partner, please stop dating. This combination of social avoidance and fear of intimacy cannot end well. Slide 38. The next stage, according to Erikson, is generativity versus stagnation. Assuming you find a workable relationship, you will spend young adulthood building a future. And if you live a full lifespan, you will spend about half of your life in middle adulthood, where the issue you face is generativity, or producing something important like children or work, versus stagnation, which would be not producing. After this stage, if all goes well, you take pride in your success. If not, then your difficulties and disappointments continue into old age, where the issue is integrity versus despair. Those with integrity feel satisfied with their life's experiences. Those who feel despair do not feel satisfied with their life's experience. To be clear,
Your satisfaction in old age depends on how you lived while you were younger. Now is the time to make the memories for the future. Slide 39. Just thinking about the fact of eventual death evokes distress. To go on with life effectively, we try to shield ourselves from thinking too much about dying. When something reminds you of your mortality, you do whatever you can to reduce your anxiety. You reassure yourself that you still have many years to live. You also think about the good job you have or hope to have, the high salary you earn or expect to earn, and the exciting things you will do during the rest of your life. These strategies are considered proximal defenses in a larger framework known as terror management theory, because they relate to you directly and the things in your immediate environment. A reminder of death influences people to defend their worldviews. You reaffirm your religious beliefs, your patriotism, or other views that help you find meaning in life. You vow to repair damaged relationships with relatives or friends. If you are a parent, you think more about your children who will survive after you are gone. You do whatever you can to increase your feeling of control over the future. These strategies would be considered distal defenses because they have effects that ripple further and further away from the individual. So proximal would be close, distal would be distant. Your proximal defenses are the things that you can control to keep these ideas away from you, and your distal defenses are the things that you set up for the future as things get further and further away from you. Slide 40. And let's wrap up our discussion about development by talking about diversity in development. Slide 41. Gender. Males and females differ biologically in many ways that influence behavior. Some brain areas are proportionately larger in men, and other areas proportionately larger in women. Certain genes are more active in male brains, and other genes are more active in female brains on average. However, behavioral differences are small to negligible in most regards. Some examples of differences include the following. Boys are more active, whereas girls have better self-control. Men and women tend to carry books in different ways. On average, females are better than males at recognizing faces and detecting emotional signals. When given directions, men are more likely to use directions and distances, such as go 4 blocks east, whereas women are more likely to use landmarks, such as go until you see the library. Although men and women differ in miscellaneous behavioral ways, they do not differ in intellectual abilities as far as researchers can tell. And while the details of this may be controversial in some circles, there is a biological influence on gender differences, as well as social influences. Let's take a closer look at social influences in the form of gender roles. Slide 42. Parents and others convey certain expectations of how boys and girls will act. And while biology may play a small role, these expectations substantially influence behavioral development. Fortunately, ideas about gender roles are changing in our culture, hopefully bending the arc of progress towards justice and equality. Slide 43. Some behaviors are remarkably similar across cultures. For example, the duration of the average non-romantic hug is 3 seconds, same for people all over the world. In contrast, in Europe and North America, parents put their newborn in a crib, encouraging independence from the start. In Asia, infants sleep in the parent's bed. European and Americans consider the Asian custom strange, and Asians consider the European-American custom cruel. Describing the effects of culture is difficult and often prone to overgeneralizations. For instance, the idea that Westerners are more individualistic compared to their collectivist cultures of China. That said, there is a growing body of evidence to support the idea that we, in the United States and the West in general, are psychologically weird. Weird is an acronym for Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. And it is our weirdness that may account for certain broad psychological differences across cultures. Slide 44. Growing up as a member of an ethnic minority poses special issues. Achieving ethnic identity is comparable to the process adolescents go through in finding an individual identity. In most cases, minority group members who achieve a strong, favorable ethnic identity have high self-esteem. However, the outcome depends on the status of one's group. With a diverse population, there will be areas of biculturalism where traditions of a country of origin are interwoven into the current culture. Naturally, this will lead to biracialism where one's parents are of different ethnic origins. Slide 45. Birth order. This one's always fun, especially to people like me, because I'm the youngest in my family. So of course I want to know, right? I am the stereotypical youngest child. So let's see if that stereotype holds. Birth order. Research must carefully separate the effects of birth order from those of family size. The effect of birth order seems to be small when you take into account how big the family is. For instance, many studies comparing firstborn versus later-born children have failed to separate the effects of birth order from the size of the family. So family size seems to be one of those confounding variables when trying to do these correlational studies between birth order and any kind of personality trait. Third variable problem. Slide 46. The effects of parenting. Oh, here we go. Psychologists have done a great deal of research comparing parenting styles to the behavior and personality of their children. Much of this research is based on 4 parenting styles described by Diana Baumrind. There's the authoritative parents. These parents set very high standards and impose controls. But they're also warm and responsive to the child's communications. They set limits, but adjust them when appropriate. They encourage their children to strive toward their own goals. As compared to authoritarian parents. These are like the authoritative parents, except they set firm controls and are emotionally more distant from the child. Once they set rules, they do it without explaining the reasons behind them. Get it done because I said so. Then there's the permissive parents. Permissive parents are warm and loving, but undemanding. Then we have the indifferent or uninvolved parents. These parents spend little time with their children and do little more than provide them with food and shelter. Research has found small but reasonably consistent links between parenting styles and children's behavior. For example, most children of authoritative parents are self-reliant, cooperative, and successful in school. Children of authoritarian parents tend to be law-abiding but distrustful and not very independent. Children of permissive parents are often socially irresponsible. Children of indifferent parents tend to be impulsive and undisciplined. For years, psychologists assumed that parents' indifference leads to impulsive, out-of-control children. However, as Judith Rich Harris points out, other explanations are possible. Maybe impulsive, hard-to-control children cause their parents to withdraw into indifference. Or maybe the parents and children share genes that lead to uncooperative behaviors. Similarly, the kindly behaviors of authoritative parents could encourage well-mannered behaviors in their children. But it is also likely that children who are well-behaved from the start elicit kindly, understanding behaviors in their parents. The plot thickens. Slide 47. Children reared by gay or lesbian parents develop about the same as those reared by heterosexuals in terms of social and emotional development, mental health, romantic relationships, and sexual orientation. Slide 48. The effects of divorce on children are highly variable. Some children remain distressed for years, whereas others recover quickly. This seems to depend on how old the child is when the parents divorce, with lower distress and impact on children the older they are. Even so, a few seem to do well at first, but become more distressed later. Others are resilient throughout the parents' divorce and afterward. Slide 49. This is the end. This is chapter 5. We're talking about human development, and in doing so, we have talked about prenatal development, how we study development, the cognitive and psychosocial theories of development, including attachment, and we've talked about growing up in a diversity of households. I will see you all next chapter.